What is going on, guys? It's Real Touch GML here, back with another Neon platformer Java game tutorial. And today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking into the GameObject abstract class that we're going to be creating and the enumeration ID system that we will be implementing. So basically what I mean by this is the way we're going to set up the game is every object in our game is going to extend our GameObject class. Alright, so everything is going to be a game object. Now, once we get into like the cool particle effects and such, those are going to be its own separate functions. But as far as, say we have coins, we have the player, we have mobs, we have, a cool bullet portal gun type thing. Whatever we decide to do, it's going to be a game object. Alright, so let's get right into that now. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new package. And instead of window at the end here, I'm just going to name it framework. And in here, I'm going to create a new class. And I'm going to make it abstract. And the name is going to be GameObject. So now we have a public abstract class, GameObject. So what can we do? Let's go ahead and set up a couple variables just to begin. So let's create the protected float x and y. Let's also create protected float velocity x equals 0 and velocity y equals 0. Okay. Now let's create the constructor. So public game object float x float y. This dot x equals x. This dot y equals y. All right. So there we go. Now what we're going to do is we're going to set up a couple functions that are required for our GameObject class to have. So I'm going to create a public abstract void tick method, and inside this tick method I'm going to set a linked list parameter, GameObject, call it object. And what this linked list parameter does, and I'll get into it a little bit later on, but this is going to be for collision detection. If this confuses you, take it out then. And we can add it back when we implement our collision detection. But yeah, that's just for that. So let's also create a public abstract void render method, graphics G. We can Control-Shift-O to import that. Okay. Now let's create a public float getX method, and this should be abstract. Public abstract float getY. Public abstract void setX float x. Public abstract void setY float y, and I'm gonna copy this and paste it for the same thing with our velocities. So get velocity x, get velocity y, set velocity x, set velocity y. Put it in here, velocity x, velocity y. So here we go. Now we have the basic functions that every game object is going to need to have. So every time we use this, game object, we're gonna need these methods. Now let's also create our ID function. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create another variable type, protected object ID. It's gonna be the type of object ID. I'm gonna name it ID, and in here, object ID ID. And this dot ID equals ID. Now object ID is not actually a variable type in the JRE. That's actually something we're going to create ourselves. So if we right click and we create a new enum, not class or interface, enum, and we're going to call it object ID. And in here, think of this as a library to hold all of the objects in our game. So the only object we're going to have in our game is going to be the player for now. So just type in player. Now we are going to have, like coins and mobs and all that fun stuff, but for now just say player because that's all we're going to have. Alright, so now as you can see this works, and let's create one more method public abstract object ID get ID, and that's going to return our ID so that we can check what the actual game object is, because since everything is going to be related to this game object that we just created, there is going to be confusion whether that game object be the player or be a mob or be a coin or whatever. So now that this is all set up, we can use this for all of our objects in our game, and it should be pretty cool. So just to kind of test it out, let's go ahead and create a new package real quick, and let's just name it objects. And if we go ahead and create just a test, so just name it test, and we extend GameObject, just like that, we import it, and as you can see, we get an error here, and that's because we need to add the constructor, which adds our constructor for us, and we get another error, and that's because we need to add implemented methods. So as you can see, we get all of the methods that we created in our GameObject class here. So we go ahead and delete all of this override stuff because I don't really like it. And now inside here, what we can do is for object ID, instead of returning null, we can return ID because that's a variable we can now use. For this dot set velocity, this dot velocity y equals velocity y, because velocity y is a variable that we set up in our game object here. And by the way, protected, if you don't know what that means, basically it means the child can use the variables but nothing else. So it is public to the game object class and the test class here. Alright, so you can just fill in all these functions here. You know, this dot velocity x equals velocity x, return velocity y, return velocity x, you know, whoops, this dot y equals y, this dot x equals x. Make sure to fill these in too, because we're going to be using these functions and they're going to actually need to have some logic behind them, or else you're not going to get really what you want. So here we have the render and the tick. Alright, so there we go. So now later on we are going to be adding more methods to our game object here, and then in turn we're going to be using some methods that we only really need for one actual side. So like player, we need to set the jump height or whatever if we hit the space key to jump. So by doing that, you'll notice if we say we take out getX method, we're going to get an error because that's actually required. But if we make this class an abstract class and we cut that out, we're actually not going to need that anymore. So it's not actually being taken up. But for now, just make it a class and everything should be good. So if we go into our game here, just to kind of test it out, we make a new game object. So game object, we'll name it object. And in our constructor, public game, as you can see, we could say object dot, and as you can see, we get all of these different methods here. So we could say call object dot get ID and everything. So we can actually call that now, and that's going to be very useful for us. So go leave a like, go and subscribe. Let's try for 70 likes this time. And now that we've got all of this completed, next tutorial we are going to get into creating our player class and getting rid of this test class, and everything should be good. So go leave a like, go and subscribe. I'll of course see you guys tomorrow. Alright, peace.